The world is waking up, and you finding your way here today is no coincidence. The spirit world always has a way of guiding us where we most need to be at the absolute perfect time. I'm your host, Lindsay Morlock, and you're listening to the Guided Podcast, where we explore how the spirit world works on our behalf to guide us along our paths. This is where you'll learn how to live a life that is both conscious and connected, so you can supercharge your pathway to healing and open to life's magic and miracles. Come along this journey to see how guided you truly are. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Guided Podcast. And this week, I am so excited to be able to introduce you to Abigail Wilber. Abby is a kids yoga and mindfulness teacher, mentor, and coach. And her passion is to teach people life skills that are often overlooked in schools in order to support their mental health and well-being. So she coaches adults who feel lost in the world to feel more connected with themselves, their purpose, and the world around them by examining and rewriting the beliefs they hold about themselves, understanding their biological limitations as human beings, and building resiliency through mindfulness. She teaches kids yoga and mindfulness and mentors new kids yoga mindfulness teachers to develop confidence and skills to navigate challenges in and outside of the classroom. You can actually find some of her work on Insight Timer, where she offers free mindfulness practices. And Abby also co-hosts the Anxiety Warriors podcast, a podcast dedicated to advocating for anxiety and mental health awareness. And so one of the reasons I felt deeply called to have Abby on the show is because when I was going through my own kids yoga and mindfulness training, Abby was my trainer. And throughout my training, I was incredibly impressed with not only what an amazing teacher she is, but you could just tell in working with her that she has this ability to hone in on someone's core essence, their heart, really allowing them to be seen for exactly who they are, exactly how they show up. And while I feel like this is such a beautiful quality in general, I just found it incredibly impactful as a trait in working with kids, especially because Abby just has this ability to see kids who in the classroom may have been labeled in a way that marginalized them from their peers, whether, they were deemed as a behavior problem or some other label, right? Abby truly approaches her work and these kids in a way that they all just felt seen and could show up as exactly who they were. And I always had great admiration and respect for how she was able to break through to these young little souls. So Abby, thank you so much for being here today.
Yay! Thank you. What an introduction. Like that is just, we can't even talk after this. I need to soak up what you just said. That was so just, I felt seen. So thank you so much.
Glad.
Yeah. Oh, that was really touching. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm just so grateful that you get to share all of your wisdom and your story with everyone today. And so in diving right in, why don't you just start by sharing with all of our listeners, what your unfolding of your own life's journey has been, and how has that brought you to the place that you currently are today?
Yeah. And, spoiler alert, I wasn't born able to just see people for who they were and accept them, right? That's definitely been a practice where, I'm still practicing with grownups and stuff, but with kids, it's definitely something that you just start to build that muscle until it's super strong. I feel like for me, the journey really started in my 20s. In my early 20s, right after college, there was all this pressure to define myself and who am I and what am I going to do with this one life I have to live, right? There's all this pressure. And at the time I was working at a school for children with autism, and I was really enjoying it, but it didn't pay that well, right? And so there was this financial pressure, and then who am I going to be pressure, and what am I going to do with my life? And all of that discomfort led me to therapy. And I had this amazing therapist who was helping me both with my anxiety and my ADHD. But I was really fortunate that he was into Buddhism and mindfulness. So he was the first person to introduce me into these techniques and these skills and the practice. And he had suggested I try an 8-week MBSR, which is mindfulness-based stress reduction course. And that basically opened me up to, just what's possible, right? And so from that 8-week course, I started taking yoga classes. I was like, oh, this is new. This is interesting, right? And so I started like doing yoga classes at the local studio. And, at first for me, like they're chanting and they're, doing weird things with their body. And I'm like, oh my gosh, thank God I don't have a friend here because I'd be laughing. Right. Like, right. That's where I was. I was in my early 20s. Like that stuff was weird, but there was something about it. Right. And so in that time of my life, I was like seeking, I was searching for meaning, I was searching for understanding, and I felt so lost and directionless, right? I just wasn't sure what to do with my life. And then when I'm taking these yoga classes, there was just these moments of like, I couldn't explain it. Right. I started to feel like more home and at home in my body. And like, that's easy to explain. Like people can understand that. But then there was like these like out of body connections that I had with my body. Like there was just these profound moments, right? Where I was learning like a new way of being with myself and being with others and being with this community in this yoga class. And so that really like led me to want to do an adult yoga teacher training. Right. And so all of that started to really give me meaning in my life and more understanding in my life. But it wasn't like the great awakening yet. Right. It was like little bits and pieces. I'm reading like Pema Chodron books and, other like self-help books and stuff. And then they're all just like little pieces of this bigger puzzle. And then right around like 26, 27, I had heard about this thing called the Empowerment Workshop. And it was at the Omega Institute in upstate New York. And it was luckily close to where I lived at the time. And that workshop forever is like the place in my heart where like it changed my life, right? Like that was like my awakening. Right. And I've had other awakenings since, but that like forever is like the thing I hold on to. And a few different things happened in this workshop. One of them was that it gave me a chance to really look at my life in many different areas, right? So by the time I was 27, my life was my life. It wasn't like my emotional life and my work life and my money life and my relationship in a romantic sense and in a friendship sense. And just really, having discontent, feeling like not like happy about my life is different than maybe not feeling happy about the finances in my life, right? So it gave me this chance to look at the different areas and then think about what was really possible for those areas. So there was like that moment of like self-awareness and starting to being open to the possibilities for my life. The second thing that really like so greatly impacted my life was I was speaking to one of the trainers, and I was telling him about one of my goals. And he was like, okay, so why don't you do it? And I was like, because I'm not good enough. Right. And he was like, who told you that? And I was like, wait, what? That's not a fact. Some people, yeah, right. Like I just thought some people were good enough to write books and some people weren't, and I was in the not good enough category. And in that moment where I realized that like that narrative, along with so many more, were not true, right? It changed everything. It changed everything about how I wanted to interact with myself, what I wanted to believe about myself, what I wanted to believe about the world around me. And in that moment I flipped from, and I had to actively work and like really work at changing the habit of mind, but from thinking I'm not good enough to thinking like I am capable of being powerful and light, like a lightness to life. Everything didn't have to be so heavy, so serious. Right. So that was the workshop. But then the other two parts where everyone else in the workshop was suffering too. Like everyone else was feeling lost, at least in some area of their life. Everyone else was looking for some type of meaning. And it made me realize like, oh, I'm not alone in these feelings. right? It allowed me to really see other humans in a way I had never seen them before, because people always looked like they had it together.
Yeah, that's so true. I think so many people can connect to that.
Yeah. And so that for me was like a huge moment of like feeling connected to others. So the first was like feeling connected to myself. I can change my narrative. Next, feeling connected to others. And then the third part was in this workshop, you examine like your level of trust, right? And trust can mean so many things to so many people, but in this workshop, it's like your trust in yourself, your trust with others, and your trust in something greater. And I realized, like, oh my God, I have like zero trust, like in myself, with others, and in something greater. Right. And I was like,
right there with you. Yeah.
yeah. And it's like this huge, it's like, wow. Like there's like an inner loneliness when you can't trust yourself or others, or just something you can't explain. And so I realized in that moment that that was something I wanted to do too, was to build trust with myself, in the ability to trust others, and in the ability to at least be open to the unknown. Right. And so that's really where like the awakening started, where the journey really started. And it gave me permission to approach life with a more like lighthearted curiosity, to really start to question my narratives about what I've been told and what I've been telling myself. And then really the practicing of being okay being me, which was probably like the hardest part of the practice.
Yeah. And what is like, I can relate to so much of what you're saying, because I think when you're committed to self-improvement, and like you, I can totally relate to reading the self-help books and
Yes.
searching for meaning and searching for answers. And you can immerse yourself in this world almost to the detriment of the joy in life, right?
Yes.
It's so heavy sometimes, like it gets so serious. And I think we're meant to enjoy the ride. We're meant to enjoy the journey. But when we're so committed to self-improvement, that can overtake, I think, the focus of life also needing to be enjoyed and savored
Yes.
along the path, right?
Yes. Yeah. Because I think some of the message is, I mean, I'm at a point in my life now where I really try to avoid self-help books, right? I'm like, no, I'm okay right now. Let me enjoy some fiction, right?
Yeah.
But I think like the self-help books, like they're all making money by us thinking we're not good enough, right? There's always room for improvement. And I do agree that there is room for improvement. There are areas to grow, there are habits to change, there are things to learn. But when, for me, I was so committed to constantly learning and changing, it just became too much.
That makes so much sense. And I think this is one of the ways as human beings that we give our power away, right? We look to someone outside of ourselves, whether it's a belief, whether it's a teacher, whether as a guru, and they must know better than I
Oh my God.
or my life.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. They have really good marketing and branding techniques, like those gurus.
Yeah.
And like we can definitely talk about that, because that's the thing, is part of the suffering for me was the always comparing myself. And this is like before social media, right? Like I didn't have Instagram in my 20s, like, like but I read the books, and I would see the talks, and I would go live to events, and these people just seemed like they had this deep practice that they've just like found like ultimate inner peace, right? And
Yeah.
the thing is, it's all a lie. It really is. They're human. They are human, and they're not all good people anyway, right? So that was like a huge thing, is like, right, we seek within to find our truth. We don't have to listen to other people.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious, one of the things you mentioned as you were talking about your experience with yoga and using yoga and your body as this vehicle of reconnecting with yourself. And as someone who I can totally identify with not trusting yourself, not trusting others, not trusting something greater, like I feel like I'm right there with you. That is also my path. But one of the ways that we learn to trust ourselves, our wisdom, is in our bodies.
Yes.
And so what was that journey like for you to reconnect with that wisdom through reconnecting with your physical body?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was slow. It was a slow journey, right? Like I had a like handful of aha moments, but especially at the beginning of my yoga journey, I relied on the experts to tell me about my body. Right. So I know things are changing, but at one point in time in yoga, you would go to the yoga class and the yoga teacher would know more about your body than you. Right. They would know how to put you in the poses. They would know what your limits were. They would know when to push you further. Right. And honestly, that actually led to me getting injured in yoga a few times. And again, I just felt like I trusted the teacher. Right. So there was a trust with the expert. There was a trust with the teacher. And it was less about that connection to my body in trusting my body and trusting it's okay to not push myself. Right. So it was like definitely a slow process. And it honestly wasn't until I learned more about like trauma informed teaching and consent that I was like, oh, wait a second. Like I can tell like yoga teachers, don't put your hands on me. I can tell yoga teachers like, no, my body won't do that, or I don't want to try to do that. Right.
Yeah.
Also, I'll just like, I think his name was Paul Greeley, did like an anatomy course that you could get like a DVD for. And eventually I also studied with Leslie Kaminoff and Amy Matthews. And all three of them shared this thing about like, unless your yoga teacher has x-rays of your body, right? They don't really know your body because not all bodies can do the same thing. Like even the depth of our hip socket and the way the femur connects, one person might have a really deep hip socket and one might have a shallow, right? And so there was these like understanding that not all bodies are the same, not all bodies can perform the same. And I can really advocate for my body is when I start to really develop that sense of trust and listening. But it had to do with a lot of undoing of trusting the expert and realizing they're not an expert of my body.
Yeah. And I think so much of what you're saying, I flash to this like good girl syndrome in a way that I totally have, where it's like, I was a good student. I paid attention in class. Like I'm such a rule follower. And I think, and that's part of that good girl syndrome, right? Where everybody else knows best. I'm going to follow what they say to do. And I got a lot of probably praise and cred for doing that in a more public external way. And yet it was totally at the expense of myself, which in your case led to injury, right?
Yes. And shame. You say good girl, I say people pleaser, but it's the same thing. It's the same mentality. And I remember one time in a yoga class, it was an Iyengar class, and the Iyengar teachers, like I loved Iyengar. I loved it. But they definitely came off like they knew what was best always for everybody, right? And so in the class, the teacher paused at one point to like remodel a pose. And in that pause, I went and took a sip of my water. And then that teacher stopped the class and shamed me in front of the entire class for putting out my yoga fire.
Wow.
And I never went back to that class, but it wasn't until like years later that I realized that, first of all, like that was harm that she did. She shamed me. That was not trauma-informed teaching. And second of all, like how does she know if I'm dehydrated or not? Like how do like I understand the lesson she was trying to teach, but no human should tell another human when they can and can't drink water just because it's like their belief and not mine. So there's just
not to mention, this is how we discount, even in kids, right? This is how we discount. You don't know what your physical needs are. Like they're raising their hand and wanting to go to the bathroom. And I get that sometimes kids are trying to get out of, doing something or whatnot, but we are actively teaching people that what they need is not okay.
Right. The teacher in the room knows better about your body. And, even with that, like, and I won't go on a full tangent here, but a little tangent is even with that, like I remember in high school, okay, I was not diagnosed at the time with ADHD or anxiety, right? But I definitely struggled with both, like really bad. And sometimes in high school, when, the teacher was talking just so much that my mind felt like it was going to explode, I couldn't say like, hey, you're talking too much. Can I please go for a walk so that I can come back and be present again? Right. Yeah. I would say, hey, can I go to the bathroom?
Right.
And so, I was trying to avoid something, but it was actually so that I could perform better when I got back.
Right, to support yourself. That's what it is, right? We don't know if we're in that kind of dynamic. We don't know why someone is doing what they're doing. And most kids also don't have the conscious awareness. At high school you may have, but certainly younger kids, they
Yeah.
might just have an urge to do
Right.
something that is supportive of what they need, and yet we might be judging it as something else, and we're doing a disservice to that level of trust that they have within themselves, or at least that inclination that is supporting them somehow.
Right. It's the message very early on. The grown-ups or the experts know better about your body than you do. And that gets really messy in some cases, right? And so it's like, it's just switching it up. It's like, okay, I see you have to use the bathroom, but can you wait 5 minutes, right? Like, as opposed to saying, no, you don't have to go. No, you're not hungry. No, you're not cold, right? It's like, none of us know how someone else is doing. We don't know their experience.
Yeah. And I think I'm curious, how your own journey with yoga and learning this about your own body has now informed the work that you're doing with kids, teens. I know you work with adults too, but how has that helped, kind of expand and bridge your own experiences to now what you believe?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, this might be like an ADHD thing. I don't know what it is, right? It could just be a me thing. But for me, I can't preach without also practicing, right? Like if I'm going to teach something, I need to feel it. It needs to be meaningful to me. Otherwise, I can't do it, right? And so like the journey to teaching kids was a lot of my own suffering, right? And then trying to figure out how to navigate it in a way that's worked for me. And so that's led me to like doing 10-day silent Vipassana retreats, right? That's led me to really sitting in discomfort, like in the body, right? In the mind, and figuring out how to navigate that. Now, I would not recommend Vipassana to kids ever, and I would not recommend it to a lot of adults either, right? Like you have to be in a place where you're really ready for that type of meditation. But it was like experiences of that kind of discomfort, and also just experiences of really knowing my own experience, like the things that stuck out to me were like, as a kid, always like feeling like there was something wrong with me, feeling like people didn't understand me, feeling like I didn't always like fit in with the group. And so when working with adults and with kids, like I see them through that lens of like that compassion of, I don't know what they're thinking, right? I don't know how they're feeling. But I can imagine that's similar to things I've had in the past too. And so that's really just understanding my experience, understanding how behavior communicates needs, met or unmet, right? Is what's really informed my way of teaching kids. Because if a kid talks back to me, I'm not going to say like, oh, that kid's a little shit. Right? Like I might feel that for a minute, like, how dare you speak back to me? Right. But the thing is that is information that I can be curious about with that kid. And so that's really like been a long journey and a long practice, but a lot of it is just really trying to embody mindfulness, embody this gentle, curious approach, right? And sometimes it's like putting on a pair of sunglasses. Like I don't see it through that lens always. I might be in the grocery store and I am not gentle and curious with someone that's like, I don't know what they're doing, but they're doing something annoying, right? But especially when it comes to kids, I'm always like putting on that pair of glasses and just really embodying what it means to be present with them and see them and be curious. So also they can start making sense of maybe some of their behaviors and their actions and stuff.
Yeah, that was one thing that always struck me when we would be in the training, is how you would use these moments, right? These like one-off interactions to empower the kids to be their own problem solvers.
Yes.
You never really seem to put yourself in a position, even as the adult in the dynamic of, I know what's better for you. You would lead them to facilitate their own little critical thinking process to help them arrive at their best conclusion. And I'm like, what kind of world would it be if we all had been right, like kind of trained in that way, that you do have your own best answers within you.
Yes.
And let's allow enough space or pause to help you arrive at that answer.
Right. And that, I mean, that problem solving is the practice, right? It's not the practices that I want to teach in the class. It's those moments there where, I mean, even just recently, I was teaching a group of kids, and these two girls love sitting next to each other, and they love talking to each other. And then the moment class starts, they love putting their yoga mats over their heads and checking out, right? And so is it a problem? A little bit. Their parents are paying for the class, right? Like their parents want them to get something from it. It is a problem when their talking disrupts the other kids from learning. But you know, the problem isn't they're like being disrespectful. And so for about 10 minutes, me and the entire class were problem solving that. What do we do when we want to chat with our friend, but other people want to learn, you know? And like, that is the place where the learning happens. And I mean, I just see, and I have the luxury of doing that because I'm a kids yoga and mindfulness teacher, right?
Right.
But so often we always skip over that problem solving in like so many different ways. Like from, you know, we're always rushing to the next thing, right? And so even like kids like trying to put their shoes on, the parents are like, let me just tie your shoes for you. We're in a rush. We need to get somewhere, right?
Right.
Going to the grocery store, the kids might want to like explore the grocery. No, we're in a rush. We have to get to the next thing, right? And then the kid tantrums, right? So there's like all of these moments where we could have space to reflect on what's happening and how we can work through it. I'm not saying that's easy or anything, especially in this world where everything we're rushing to the next. But it's like also giving the kids in that class, the yoga and mindfulness class, the opportunity to pause and to problem solve, because so much of it is missed. Like adults are always telling them what to do, right? Put your papers away. Here, let me get it into your backpack for you. Here, let me, you know, like there's always something the adult is helping them with. So they miss out on figuring it out for themselves. They miss out on developing the fine motor skills in that moment to tie their shoes, or you know, the organizational skills to put the stuff in their backpack until they're like in college and they're like, holy crap, I'm a mess. Right? Like,
I have to do laundry. Yeah.
Right. Someone else always did it for me, you know? And so that was something that like I'm obviously very passionate about, is I'm not going to tell kids what to do. I don't know what's best for them, right? They might not know what's best for them either, but at least we can all have a safe conversation and try to figure it out together. And if what they come up with doesn't work, we can revisit it again, right? And it's like no big deal. And so, I mean, even in trainings, I know that you witnessed sometimes there was difficult adults in the trainings.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. This person, this grown-up is having a hard time, but they need to figure it out. I'm not going to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that takes an incredible level of trust in and of itself, right? Like being able to reserve judgment and trust that you're a piece of someone's journey and you're playing a role for someone, but you don't need to be the fixer. You can be a catalyst for change. You can be a catalyst for growth, but you don't need to have all the answers. And I think being able to feel good enough, right? And enough, even in that, feels like, compared to where you felt like you weren't enough, that alone feels like, wow, what expansion within yourself.
Yes. And so I like to use this phrase, control enthusiast, right? So much of my life, I've been enthusiastic about control, right?
Yeah.
And part of that, you know, falls into fixing, right? When something comes up, let me fix it right away. I got it, right?
Yeah.
Like whether I'm good enough or not doesn't matter. I can still fix it. Right. Like,
right.
you know, and so that is part of the practice. Part of the expansion is being able to not be enthusiastic about control and trusting that people will figure out, you know, what's right for them, or the trusting the process and allowing it to unfold. Because you're right. Like we're all just on these journeys with each other for moments in time. And I don't know people well enough. I'm still learning about who I am, right? So I don't know people well enough to be able to tell them what to do with their lives.
Yeah.
But I know I can be curious and ask questions and help them at least figure out something for their next step. So that's something that it's active practice, like all the time, is like, don't give answers. Don't try to fix it. Pause, be curious, and see if you can ask them some questions that'll help them on their journey.
Yeah. And it's amazing how people in general, kids or adults, right? It's amazing how people respond when you meet them at that place where you're reserving judgment. And it's like, can you just tell me more about what's going on for you right now, or that experience? I think this is, you know, it just strikes me that this is one of the problems we have in the world today in general, where people have differing beliefs from our own, and we have to, our egos want to make it right or wrong, and it's causing these polarities where people cannot coexist with one another, and it's simply not true. But if we come from this perspective of like, you have your beliefs and what works for you, and I have mine and that works for me, and we can be curious about what works for one another and still coexist in a harmonious and balanced way, that's really powerful.
Yes. I mean, that's it. Like, that is like my hope for humanity, right? Like, you can have your beliefs. I don't care what you believe. Just don't try to put it on me, right?
Yeah.
Like, don't tell me your way is the right way, because like nobody knows. We know what works for us, right? And that's the thing, is like, we don't have to be so divisive, and we don't have to be so like polar. Right? Can we just accept that we have different beliefs, and that, you know, so I love what you're saying, and the permission to say, I don't know. Like, I feel like sometimes experts and gurus and, you know, all the people with those labels, right? They're afraid to say, I don't know. They have to have all the answers.
Yeah.
Right. But I just think there is so much strength and courage in the I don't know piece. I like to think it might be this. I hope it's this. Right. But ultimately, I don't know. And I can find peace in the not knowing.
Yeah. And that's really powerful. And I feel like I want to just dive in, because you and I had a conversation before we even started recording just about this, right? Where, you know, for the listeners, Abby shared with me that she has a different lived experience with spirituality. And I'm going to ask her to dive into that in a minute. But she was like, I just want to make sure like I'm a good fit for this podcast. And that was my reaction. Like, yes, let's put it out there, because let's let everybody know that everybody has a different lived experience, and it's all great and valued and valid. And the more we can see ourselves in all of the differences as a way to help us like peel back these layers of the things that are not working for us, we start to tune in to our own authenticity and who we really are and what does work for us. So like, what was your own journey with spirituality? You know, would you dive into all of that?
Yeah. So I love this question. So, and so you and I, before we started our conversation, we had used the word woo, right? And so sometimes I use woo and sometimes I don't, because some people get offended by it. I don't want to offend anyone if they're offended by woo, right?
Right.
But, you know, shortly after that empowerment workshop, like, I went on the woo train. Like, I was looking for everything, right? I felt so good after that workshop, and I wanted to connect more. At the time, I used the word the universe, right? I had all these affirmations, like, I follow and trust my heart. You know, I have a loving relationship with the universe. And so I was seeking all this in books and talks and movies and DVDs and all, you know, all the stuff. And I mean, I went pretty deep. I don't even know like what deep is, but like I was believing so much and it felt really good. And I was believing that I could create my own reality. Now, I still believe that works. I just don't believe it the way I used to believe it. Right. And when I learned more about trauma and neuroscience, they align, they work, but they're just not as like, for me, magical thinking until I got the like science base in it. But so anyway, so I leave the workshop. I'm like, I'm really ready for like a healthy relationship. You know, I believe that the universe created me, so I have to believe that the universe created my perfect match. You know, I'm attracting my perfect match, right?
Yep.
And I attracted him magically, but it turns out he wasn't my perfect match. But but I attracted this guy into my life. We ended up dating 5.5 years. I moved to New York City. He and I shared a lot of similarities in the spiritual world, right? And so we both believed in creating our own realities, and you know, we both practiced different forms of meditation, and so there was that moment where like I felt so connected with the universe. I felt aligned and in the flow. Like, I mean, I felt amazing, and I ended up losing some friendships because I felt so good, because like people were like, you've changed, right? So that was okay. It was like, we've grown apart. And
well,
then
and that happens, right?
yes.
Seasons and lifetimes. Yeah, we definitely are like fall in and out of alignment with people for sure.
Right. And change is scary. I think some of the people that stopped being my friend because they couldn't relate, right? Like I had just had this huge like spiritual awakening, and I'm like, your thoughts create your reality. If you just have better thoughts, like your life will be better, right? I feel like some people are like, all right, get off your high horse, like, you know, but I feel like other people saw that I was like a lot more happy, and for them, they were not. And so for them, it was uncomfortable being around someone happy.
Yeah.
Right.
That's real.
Yeah. And so those, some of them we came back and were friends again at some point. But anyway, so I'm in New York. I'm with my perfect match. I'm in this relationship and all this. And then these like weird things happen. Like I'm walking down the street to pick up the kid that I nanny. And this guy like tries to steal my cell phone out of my hand when I'm talking to my mom. And I chase him down. I get my phone back, right? He doesn't get caught, but you know, like, so that like left me really like shook. And I was like, well, how did I create this? Why would I create someone trying to steal my phone? Why, you know, like, you know, going down that rabbit hole. What did my thoughts do to do that? What do I need to change about myself so I don't have a bad experience happen in my life again? Then my boyfriend at the time and I were like walking back from a show one night, and this like kid tried to pick a fight with us. Like we're just walking down the street. This guy had gotten in an argument with his girlfriend. He was pissed, and he's like trying to fight us on the street. And so again, I'm like, well, how did I draw this into my life? Right. And so then I started to become like kind of afraid of my thoughts, and like, you know, what I didn't know at the time, and I had an anxiety, but it was pretty like, it was a good relationship, right? Like my anxiety wasn't interfering with that much, but what I didn't realize is part of anxiety is intrusive thoughts. And just because you have an intrusive thought doesn't mean you're manifesting something horrible into your life, right? But I didn't know that at the time. And so then all of a sudden, like my spirituality felt scary. It was like anxiety ridden. I was like basically victim shaming myself for things that honestly I don't think were in my control. I don't think I attracted that stuff into my life, right? Can I learn from those things? Maybe, sometimes, not always. Sometimes you're just in a random place walking down a street and some guy tries to pick a fight with you, right? Like, and so from there I was kind of like, I don't know what to believe now, right? You know, around that time my dad was diagnosed with cancer. Did he create the cancer? No. Like maybe his childhood trauma led him to doing unhelpful things throughout his life, right? That maybe did, but also maybe not, right? So I started to just really question what I was doing, like what I was thinking. And so then right around that time, the Netflix documentary, I can't even remember what it's called now, maybe Dama Brothers, which was about Vipassana, and these people teaching Vipassana to some prisoners in a prison. And I watched it and I was like, okay, I need to do this, because the peace that the prisoners had afterwards, I was like, I need a reset. I need to figure out my relationship to this greater thing I don't understand, because right now we're at odds and it's causing me more stress and anxiety than joy, right?
Yeah.
Or peace. So I did the Vipassana workshop. It's a 10-day silent retreat. You don't make eye contact with people. You don't touch people. You're pretty isolated. You sit for like 10 hours a day meditating. It's really hard. It's really uncomfortable. But I dove in. I was like, I got this. I got to do it. Right. Like those prisoners did it and they came out the other side. And the thing that really changed my relationship in my spirituality was that experience taught me so much about impermanence and lack of attachment to things, and not needing to understand and put a label on everything, right? Like sometimes things can happen, we can be a witness to it, and we can pause before we give a narrative to it, right? And so that's like what really started to transform this thing of me having this deep connection with the universe, and then feeling like, oh, I've angered the universe, oh, I misunderstood the universe, to this place of just like an embodied mindfulness, like an embodied curiosity to life, which still really helped me feel like in the flow of life. Like even my body, I can't even really explain it, but on the 10th day of the retreat, well, the 11th day of the retreat, they keep you for like 12, but on the 11th day is the day that you're supposed to start speaking again. And I had such inner peace. My body felt like firm jello. Like I can't even explain it. Like I just felt glowing inside my body, and I felt like so connected. And part of me, like, where does my body end and everything around me begin, in this like not woo way, but it could sound woo, but it was just like I felt relaxed, like this deep, relaxing peace, right? And we had to start speaking again. I was like crying. I was one of the people who didn't want to speak again. I didn't want to lose it, right?
Yeah.
But in that experience, it really taught me that I can be connected. Is it me? Is it something outside of me? Whatever it is, it doesn't matter, because I don't need that label. I don't need that. I can be okay in the not knowing and still feel this peace and this connection. What I will say, because I think it's important to say, is that has even evolved over time, in the sense that I can witness stuff and I can accept stuff, but also I can witness stuff and choose not to accept it, because I think that sometimes mindfulness gets confused with like complacency, right? And there was a time where in the embodying of mindfulness, I let people do horrible shit, right? It's like
I think that's such an important point, because I think, and I tell me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing from you is like, just because we're on these, well, life paths, spiritual paths, whatever you want to call them, it doesn't mean that challenges, obstacles, like some bad stuff isn't going to happen along the way, right? And sure, can we make purpose out of all of it? Of course, right? Like we're always learning and growing. And I think everything serves a purpose in some regard in terms of helping us to evolve. But what you're saying is really important, because acceptance doesn't mean that we need to allow people to obliterate and annihilate our boundaries, and that we just have to sit there, grin and bear it, and take it. Like that's actually, but it's a way shower at the same time, right? Where it's either showing us, like when we don't feel good, like that is showing us the contrast of how we want to feel. Like when stuff is happening to, like, feels like it's happening to us, that is showing us in this case, like, no, like I need to set a boundary here, or I need to stand up for myself, or not just, is that the complacency that you're like, I'm not going to just sit back and take it?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because that's, through many parts of my mindfulness journey, that was what I thought the teaching was to be okay with whatever happens, right? Like I can't control other people, but I can control how I react to it. Right. Yeah. And And that's all true, right? And it doesn't mean being apathetic. It doesn't mean not speaking up, right? It doesn't mean just accepting the situation. And that has been like a lot of the practice in my more recent years is navigating the space of when do you accept what's happening, or when someone is treating you poorly, when do you speak up about it? When do you set a boundary? When do you actually just cut them off? Like, just because you're practicing acceptance and compassion doesn't mean, at least for me, that I allow just bad behavior because there's someone that's suffering. It's like, no. That's part of the mindfulness practice for me is being able to know my boundaries and enforce them, and sometimes walking away from people, right? Because I got the idea I'm supposed to love and accept everyone. And I can see people, right? Oh, this person is having a really hard time. They've probably had a rough life, or maybe someone they just like lost someone they love, whatever it is. It doesn't mean that I need to accept their behavior. It doesn't mean I need to accept them in my life. I can still have empathy or compassion and not be a part of their life. And so I just feel like that's important, because I think sometimes, at least for me in the mindfulness journey, I thought it really was about being a witness, right? And that can help, but then you need to also be ready for an active practice of mindfulness. What's the next step if someone's hurting you? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is so important. And sometimes I even think it's a both and, right? Like we can move into this place of acceptance almost around like, okay, this happened and it did not feel good. And like, that's the piece where we're accepting, like, this happened and it was not okay. And now what is that next step? And what is that calling for attention in our life? And I think what I hear in some of your narrative too, it's like coming back to those patterns of like the people pleaser, where, right, like acceptance can be so muddied with being a people pleaser. Because if we're a people pleaser, we've probably been annihilating our own boundaries our whole life on some level anyway, right? And then this acceptance just becomes another way that pattern plays out. That's what's so fascinating about all of our spiritual journeys, or just our life journeys in general, because if we don't see these patterns and how they're playing out, they will literally infiltrate every facet of your life until you see it.
Yes. And it gets just more and more like when you're saying that, it made me think of Leslie Kaminoff would say, be more clever than your habits, right? Because if you are a people pleaser, right, and you're like, oh, that's it, I'm going to stop being a people pleaser, it's going to be sneaky. It's going to find a new way to do it. It's a very deeply ingrained habit from childhood. It's going to find a new way to pop up. But you're like, no, I'm practicing mindfulness, right? And it's like, no, actually, you're practicing people pleasing, but maybe you have more peace on the inside this time.
Yeah. And it's so important, because what you're describing too is also like the different ways that we bypass facets or patterns or like learnings in our life, right? Like when you were talking about like, oh, there's so many people with the power of positive thinking. Like, I'm just going to magically think my way into law of attracting stuff. And it's, there's a lot of people that just believe like you can never have a negative thought ever again. Right. And that your life is going to be catastrophic. Like, it's just, that's not realistic.
No.
And there's nuggets of wisdom in positive thinking. There's nuggets of wisdom in the contrast and like what that's showing us and calling for healing on some level, or to bring awareness to. But we make all of these little things like they just find a way to be part of the story of our patterning that just keeps repeating itself over and over and over again. So you're so right. It's so covert. And I think that's the piece of mindfulness where it's like, how can we bring attention to all of those pesky little ways that ego mind is showing up and rolling out these patterns that keep us stuck in the same doom loops over and over and over again. And where I imagine the meditation is helpful, it's like giving yourself, right? Because that's building a muscle in your brain that gives you enough pause to be able to respond as opposed to react, right? And that's part of what I always loved about the kids training, because of like the adults need to play these games, especially when the adults can't meditate. Like we should talk about that,
Yes. I mean, yes to everything. And and you said something and then my brain went blank, but I really want to comment on what you just said and now I forgot it.
It's okay. It'll come back.
Okay. It'll come back. It'll come back.
I think I was just trying to, highlight the fact that like all of the ways our minds just upgrade, right? Yeah. And so our ego upgrade.
Yeah. And yeah, so yeah, and the other part that I'll say in that is like these things get like programmed in childhood, right? Like and we don't know, are they programmed from us? Are they programmed from our caregivers? Are they programmed from our teachers? Are they programmed from like society? Right? Because like certain religions say you can't express emotion, right? And so then when you look at like law of attraction and you can only have positive thinking, if you grew up in a place where you couldn't express emotion and then you're like, oh yeah, law of attraction, only positive thinking for me, right? It's again that little like that habit that's now finding a new way to plug itself in. And I just wanted to hit that piece because like sometimes we think it's from us, but sometimes it's like from centuries of society, right? Like giving us a message for hundreds of years, whatever that message might be. And so it's so deeply ingrained in us. We have to be super clever in understanding ourselves. And I'll say one more thing that's really helped me is, so I've been like a journaler my whole life, right? I haven't journaled recently and now I'm going to feel guilty, but I've been a journaler my whole life. And what I sometimes have done in the past is reread the journals, because when I can read the journals after a number of years have passed, I can see, oh, what habits or beliefs were showing up that I might still have today, but I'm trying to find another way to do them.
Yeah.
Right. So that's just like a little thing that like helps me in getting to know more of myself. And then is it like a habit I want to keep doing or change? But
yeah. And that's so important because I think you're speaking to the integration, right? Like it's one thing, the first step is being aware and understanding like how we're showing up and what is going on. And then we might have a solution in some way or a behavior that we want to change, which is that solution. But if we don't integrate the learning, the patterns keep playing out over and over again.
Yes.
So along those lines, I feel like I keep thinking of this question because I'm sure there are parents listening to this being like, oh my gosh, I'm screwing up my kids, right? Like I feel like I have friends that are so hard on themselves as parents. But then when you think about just the things that roll off our tongues, right? About like, right, tying the shoes or we got to go. Or I know parents are also dealing with the stress of just being so busy. There's no time to spare. So like, what would you say to parents who are listening to this podcast? So clearly they have an interest in consciousness and right, spirituality, and they're wanting to develop conscious little beings, right, as parents. But coupling that with like this stress now of like, oh my gosh, I don't want to screw up my kids. And maybe I'm saying all the wrong things. Like, how do you help support parents who are trying to bring this more mindful approach to their parenting?
Yeah. I mean, it's rough, right? I'm not a parent. I have a lot of parent friends. I've worked with a ton of kids. I've nannied, right? Like raising kids is rough. And in this society where I don't know, like when I grew up like in the 80s and 90s, right? Like it didn't feel so busy. So I don't know what's changed. A lot of things have changed, but it just seems like we have less time in our days and more things we have to cram in and do. And on top of that, being good parents, and so I feel like the first thing is like, and maybe the most important thing is just be nice to yourself, right? Like you're probably going to screw up, right? We're all human. There is no perfect parent out there. If someone claims they're a great parent, they're lying, right? Like for real, like Instagram's crap. Like, like I like, so the first thing is really just finding some peace with your parenting, knowing you are going to screw up, but maybe you'll screw up less than your parents screwed up. And maybe you'll screw up less than your grandparents screwed up on your parents, right? Like we're all evolving and that's part of evolution. We just try to be a little bit better than the people before us. Right.
Right.
And I think in that, like permission to be gentle with yourself, permission to accept that you're not ever going to be the perfect parent, whatever that is, and you're going to be the perfect parent for who you are right now, right? In that acceptance, you're teaching your kids that they can accept more of themselves. And that's really what, like, the message, like when I work with parents, right? When it comes to working with them, I've done some parent coaching over the years. It's the awareness of what you're embodying to your kids, right? If you're telling your kids to calm down when like their Lego sculpture breaks, right? But then you're freaking out in the car in traffic, what are you modeling? Right. And so, and again, we're going to do that. We're going to mess up a million times. But I think that when we mess up, it's acknowledging it, right? Like, hey, I'm human too. I'm sorry, my child. I just lost it in the car because I'm feeling rushed, and feeling rushed makes me feel uncomfortable. I feel anxious. And the way that I deal with it is by yelling at strangers in cars next to me, right? I want to work on doing that better. I need to practice my calming down, right? But I really feel like for parents, like the two parts are, one, like it's hard. It's really hard. Whether both parents work, whether you're a single parent, whether you stay at home with your kid, no matter what, raising kids is really hard. And so just having that acceptance, like it's hard and you're going to screw up. But what do you do when you screw up, right? And I think so the second part is then just admitting you're human to your kids and repairing, right? Hey, I want to get better at not rushing you out of the house and letting you tie your own shoes. Can you help me figure out a better way that we could do that? And just really being honest with your kids, because sometimes kids can problem solve the problems that the parents have, right? So that's like ultimately, like I feel like what I say to a lot of parents is what you're modeling to your kids is more about what they're going to learn than what you say to them.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you're interested in mindfulness and approaching life with a more, mindful lens, you start doing the practices. Don't teach your kids. Don't have your kids go to another class, or do like a parent and kids class, right? If you want your kids to learn how to calm down more, then you need to figure out, like, when do you get worked up and how can you calm down more and model that. And that's always been like one of the things, like when I'm teaching kids yoga classes, they're not all beautiful and perfect. They're messy. Sometimes kids aren't paying attention. Sometimes kids are talking to each other, and sometimes I get frustrated. But instead of yelling at the kids to shut up, right? Yeah. I say, like, hey, I'm having a hard time when I'm trying to teach and no one's listening. So I need to take a break. Can someone like take over for me? Or, hey, I'm having a hard time. I'm feeling really frustrated. I don't know what we should do right now. Do we need like to play a game, And so a lot of it for me is acknowledging how I feel and then modeling it. And again, teaching kids in a class is very different than parenting. So I'm not comparing them, but I am saying, like, we can be transparent in how we feel, and that we are also working on, sharing what we're working on too.
Yeah. And I think it's important because I notice I'm seeing with some of these younger generations now coming in, they do seem more connected. They're coming in far more awake, and they're coming in far more sensitive, especially energetically, like meaning like they're more in touch with their emotions. And I'm hopeful that that's partly too, as our generations are becoming more, our parents were probably in this generation of like, suck it up and deal. Like, yes. What are feelings? We push those away. We suppress, repress, whatever. We don't need to deal with them. Our generation is more like, okay, emotions are not bad. Like, let's look at what the message is, right? And hopefully that's being passed down to the next generations. But I am seeing kids coming in with much bigger emotions, or much like more sensitivity around what they're feeling in their physical bodies, that's causing them to react in ways that they don't know how to manage. And I will never forget that you shared this story in one of our trainings about a group of, I think it was second grade boys who didn't even know that they were allowed to have emotions.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, what are we doing to socialize people, no less, young boys in our culture, to like, and if you can't have emotions, right? Like, what are we doing to people?
Yeah.
How are we socializing people to, like, no wonder people are unfulfilled and depressed, and because our emotions are guiding us
Yeah.
in the direction of our desires in
Yeah.
one way, shape, or form, right? So if like we're shutting it down that early, like what are we doing?
Right. And I mean, just to take it to a different level, just for a second, like all the violence, like most of the mass shootings, if not all, are done by men. Like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And that's the thing is like we need to teach all children, and like the whole like gender thing and boys don't cry, like we're definitely more hip to understanding that's not true, but we still like subtly tell it, right? We still like subtly give the message like girls can act this way and boys have to act this way. And I mean, even in our own relationships, if we think about like if we have like a good friend or a significant other and they're a male, like how do we feel if they're crying? How do we react to that? Right? Do we want to fix it? Do we want to change it? Do we react to them the same way we would react to a female, but so yeah, so what I will say is in the last like 10 years, especially since teaching yoga and working in schools and stuff, there has been a huge increase of social emotional learning. And I have noticed, like I went into a preschool, I don't know, like 2-3 years ago. Preschool is not usually my jam, right? When teaching kids yoga, I'll do it and I'll enjoy it for the time, but I don't seek it out there very often. And I remember going into this preschool and it was like my first time meeting these kids and they're like 4 years old. And this one kid is going, this boy is going and tackling this other boy, right? And the boy being tackled goes, "Stop, I need space." And he puts his hand up.
Wow.
And I was like, who's teaching him this? Like, that's amazing, right? He didn't push him back. He didn't like, and they were like, yeah, we've been implementing social emotional learning the last few years. And one of the things is teaching kids to say when they need space. It was like a 4-year-old saying it to another. It was like, so I definitely have hope, right? But it's still a long road. We all have to do our part in just normalizing being human and all the things that come up with being a human being.
Yeah. So with that, as we start to kind of wrap up here, like what advice would you have for people just kind of starting out on their own spiritual journeys, or around mindfulness, any of that?
Yeah. I feel like the advice that I wish I would have heard, right, is there's like no one book on spirituality, right? Like, and I know there's tons of books on spirituality, but like there's no right way to do it. There's no one way to do it, it's about defining like what spirituality means to you, because for me, I thought it had to look a certain way. I thought I had to act not human, right? Like I thought I had to be a certain way and it had to look a certain way and everything, but I realized none of that is true, right? Like for me, it's about how I feel in connection to the world around me, to my life, right? And so the advice that I would offer is like, know what you're seeking. Be clear in that. Are you seeking to find like magic, and where can you find it? Like I used to do improv, right? And part of my practice was improv, because when people can just be each other and be silly and go with the flow, like magic happens, right? And so like when I say like you can define it any way you want, like it doesn't mean like sitting in a cave meditating 10 hours. It can literally be like getting on stage and doing improv, right? It can be just things like that, and seeing the beauty and the magic in the moment. So I just feel like spirituality doesn't have to be anything like rigid. It doesn't, it's you figure out the form. And then the only other advice I would give, because I really wished I was given this advice, is do your research on the people that you're studying from. I went through so many different yoga studios and yoga lineages, and I held the gurus on pedestals and wished I could be them. And then I found out like a lot of them abuse their students financially, emotionally, sexually, physically. A lot of them were actually awful human beings that I was giving my money to and trying to be like. And so that's the other part on your spiritual journey is like, you might find something that feels like total amazing magic. Do the research on who the person is, right? And if they didn't create it, who did they study from, and who did they study from? Because abuse gets handed down, right? And so I that is one thing that I really wish I had been told, is just be more curious about the people you're learning from and who they really are. Does that align with your values?
I think you're bringing up such good points. And, you know, it's sometimes when we like leap, I know I do this, when we just want to like do something, or we see a solution that we're like, oh my gosh, like that is going to be the thing that cures me, that fixes me, that like when you're in that vulnerable place, sometimes we just have this desire to dive right in. And I know I've done that where I have not done my research. I've been lucky to work with people that have been great, but I get how that can happen. And we do need to do our due diligence and like doing research and making sure. I think you articulated it earlier when you said it doesn't feel right for you to kind of preach anything that you're not personally practicing. And I feel like that's what you're really speaking to, is like really look to make sure that people are in their integrity, right?
Yes.
Like I know I had booked a reading. You're making me think of this experience where I had even booked a reading with a medium.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew booking this reading that there was a 2-year wait list. I was totally comfortable with that because it was like this celebrity, you know, medium. And the person rescheduled the reading 6 times before never responding again, and just took my money and never delivered on the service. And, you know, it's interesting because there was clearly a lack of integrity on this person's part. And of course, I took it and looked within myself like, okay, where might I be out of my own integrity, right? Where might I not be living a truth? So there was certainly something for me to learn.
Right.
And to the earlier point, and I was going to protect my boundaries and take some steps around this person and not delivering on their service, right? So yeah, like all of these different things are really important in helping us to like stay centered. And I think the more grounded and present we are, and not in our heads, like that helps us to like follow the path to the right teacher or person, right? But like when we give our power to these other people, like and we're coming from such a vulnerable place, or so desperate for something, whether it's healing or happiness, or it's really easy to be taken advantage of.
And I mean, the wellness world is like a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Yeah.
Right. Not everyone goes into the wellness world to help people.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's like an important thing to remember, is like some people are in it for the money, and they know what to say, and they know how to act, and they know like basic psychology. Like a lot of people like have different styles of attaching to people. Right. My style is often anxious attachment. I get very attached to people. I've worked on that over the years. But so for me, like the moment I met someone, like, you know, a teacher, an expert, I instantly loved them. Right. And if they said stuff that resonated, I was like, yes, let me buy your books. Let me go to your classes. And it wasn't until much later when I did the research to realize like, oh, I don't want to give people my time, my effort, my money, my energy. I don't want to give them that stuff because they're actually not good people. Right. And so, you know, I mean, like the spiritual world and the wellness world can be so beautiful and connected, and you can meet amazing people, and you can grow and learn, and so much good can happen. And there is a lot, you know, I mean, on the other side, there's like the cult side, right? So like, you just want to be really, you want to go in with real like intentions of knowing what you're looking for. Right. And then like baby steps, don't just dive in because it feels so good right away.
Yeah. We've got to do our research, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I always tell people too, it's like, if you're ever in question from the spiritual perspective, it's like, just ask spirit to give you like a crystal clear sign that this is the direction you're supposed to head, you know? Because I know I have not waited for the sign and leapt into something. I was like, oh, why did we do this?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. My excitement got the best of me.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Abby, one of the questions I love asking people is, how do you see magic or miracles playing out in your own life?
Yeah. Yeah. I love this question. Um, I feel like there's a lot of like magic in the unknown, right? Like I did talk a little bit about like magic on stage with improv and stuff, but you're kind of like almost like looking for it. You're like, where is it? Where is it? Um, but like there's been these moments in my life that I can't really explain except for that I just knew I had to do something, right? And like a small one was when I was living in New York City. I was taking these kids I nanny to the karate dojo, and I'm usually like a little introverted and a little shy, and I like don't talk to strangers, but like there was this thing in me that was like, you have to talk to the sensei, and I didn't even know why or what, right? And I started speaking to the sensei, and all of a sudden I'm starting teaching kids yoga, which I had never done before. And so that is what got me into teaching kids yoga and mindfulness, was a conversation with the sensei,
Oh,
right? Like
wow.
that,
Yeah.
right? And so there's like these like little things. Like sometimes I'll just meet someone and I'm already like, I know we're going to be friends, right? I can't explain it. I
Yeah.
don't know why I have that feeling. And then guess what? We are friends. And it's like not even like an effort. Like it's just like
Right.
we just fall into it. But the one that's really special to me is in 2017, like just so many bad things happened, actually it was 2016 into 17. But one of the things was I was in this 5.5 year relationship with someone who I thought was my perfect match, but I already said he wasn't. We were at the time, we were 5 years into our relationship, and I was ready for marriage. I was ready for kids. We had friends that had met later than my ex and I, and they were already married and talking about kids. And it was just this really, it just didn't feel right. And I remember one time I was like, what are we doing? Right. And he was like, I don't really know. And I was like, okay, but I want to get married. And he's like, I'm still not ready. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm starting to do all this stuff with work. So let's put this conversation on hold for a moment, right? A couple months. It was when I started to first do the trainings. And and then I was like, and then let's revisit, right? And so after like another 3 or 4 months, we revisited the conversation again. And we just decided, even though we like each other, we're friends, we needed to break up. And at the time, I was like, right, like a month away from 34 years old. I'm like, oh my God, I have to start dating again. It would have just been easier to stay with this guy. We like each other. Like, we care
Yeah.
about each other. We're nice to each other, but like it wasn't right. I wanted to be married. I wanted to have kids, right? And so that happened. And then my father had pancreatic cancer, and I was caring for him, and he passed. And so all of these things were just kind of like happening. There was like a lot of loss and a lot of grief. And about a year after the breakup, I just had this like thought, you need to move to Denver. And I can't explain it, right? I can give explanation now, like, oh, I probably had this thought because I was reading this or this, but it was like, you have to go, like, figure out how to get there. Right. And so I was like, all right, I guess I'm going to go move to Denver. And I went to check it out for like a weekend. I like changed my OK Cupid zip code. Right. I ended up like messaging with someone. We ended up having a date when I was in Denver, and he was really nice. But I was like, "Hey, girl, you got anxious attachment. Don't get attached. Like, maybe you'll be friends when you move out there. Go slow." And anyway, that's all to say. I figured out how to get to Denver. I packed up my car with whatever I had. I drove cross country, and that guy is now my husband, and he is my perfect match. So that's like the magical, like, I can't explain why I felt like I needed to move to I can't, but it really, really worked out. So
I love that. And I hear that story, some version of that story over and over again, where it was like this illogical,
mhm.
like heart-based knowing that you needed to do something. and you just did it. And I give you so much credit, because I think so many of us are driven by our fears of like, and living these lives of good enoughness. Like you were saying, like this guy was a nice person, you were friends, like it could have been good enough. And the fear could have allowed you to stay in a relationship that wasn't what you really wanted, but you allowed yourself to get brave and like, you know, follow your heart. And like, it led you to where you want to be, which is so beautiful.
Yeah. Breakups are terrifying. And then they're more terrifying when you're in your 30s, right? And like, you got biological clocks, you know, you got all these things and you're like, you know, but for me in that regard, like I knew I didn't want to resent him and hate him like my ex. I knew that was more important to me than staying together and being uncomfortable. Right. And so, yeah, that's the thing. It's like, it's the listening when those moments happen, rather than ignoring them. I could have let my habits get in the way and I not talk to the sensei, or not talk to these people that I just had a good feeling about, or not move to Denver. And then, I mean, who knows where I would be, but definitely not with my husband if I didn't listen. So that definitely like worked out and felt extremely magical.
It does feel magical. I'm so glad it all unfolded in the way that it did.
Thank you.
Well, I have loved our conversation. This has been so great. Thank you so much. How can my listeners support you?
Yeah. Well, I co-host a podcast, like you mentioned at the beginning, Anxiety Warriors podcast. So you can look that up. My co-host Margot and we really just try to normalize talks around anxiety and being human and the human experience. And we have a lot of guests on talking about their own mental health journeys, from OCD, agoraphobia, depression, religious trauma. So it's really, I find it fascinating. So you can check that out, or you can look at us on Instagram at Anxiety Warriors Podcast. You can also just check me out. I offer free practices on Insight Timer. If you don't have Insight Timer, even though it is free, you can also find them on my website, abigailwilber.com. Yeah, I think that's it. I'm always, how can you support me? I don't know, be nice to people. Be kind. Understand everyone's walking with something and we just don't know, so let's all have a little kindness. That would ripple out to me at some point. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Abby. This is great.
Yes, thank you. This was, I love connecting with you. I love this conversation, and I just feel so honored to be on this podcast. So thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Guided Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would be so grateful if you would share it with a friend, or even leave me a review so we can ensure that it makes its way into the ears of listeners who need to hear these messages most. Until next time, may you remember how guided you truly are.